My name is Boulevard. This is a patch rundown. I'm a caster and analyst who you may have seen on any number of seasonal tournaments in the past, and this is a patch rundown, which means I'm going to be going card by card, telling you what I think of these changes, how impactful they're going to be for the meta, and as always, I'm going to go in the order of buffs followed by nerfs rather than the order in which the patch is written. If you want to look at any specific card, everything is timestamped down below. Let's keep the intro short, jump right in. Kicking off the buffs, Leona got an entire facelift. Now has Challenger on the front and backside, no longer has Overwhelm on the backside, but will gain Barrier every time you Daybreak, and is up to a 5 cost. This is a very big change for the archetype. One of the struggles that Daybreak would have in the past was backline access. Yeah, you had Sunburst, but that was kind of expensive, a little easy to play around depending on, what kind of turn you were getting it down on. And for the most part, it was very hard to bank spell mana in Daybreak because you were just kind of running out your units constantly on curve to try and turbo level the Leona to get into the Leona Ravoon combo, which was really your only way to end games, was stunning out the big threats and getting your opponent to constantly chump block. Now that you can pull sort of the mid-sized threats out of the way with Leona and let everything else kind of go through, I think this deck has a much better chance. But that said, I don't think this is the meta for it. I'm not going to get too much into the specifics of each individual Daybreak card that got changed. I more so just want to talk about the package as a whole while I have Leona here on screen. And overall, I think that like the Invoke changes from a couple patches back, there is a meta where this is a solid tier 1 contender. I don't think it's the meta that we're in right now. Yes, Ken and Ezreal got nerfed, so maybe things won't be as Ionia-focused as we're kind of used to, but at the end of the day, I think that Lee Sin and Nami are still going to be two of the most popular decks going into the seasonal. While you would love to be Nami and Lee Sin in the same deck, I think you are just going to see Twisted Fate Nami followed by like Akshan Lee Sin or even Victor Lee Sin. But the point is the OTK potential is very, very high, so board control doesn't matter as much. I can stabilize on 2 HP, get Lee Sin up to 10 attack, and just run away with the game, and that's the kind of meta where something like this isn't going to thrive. Now, Fiora got buffed as well, which does push us more into a board control-y mid-range style of meta, but I think that with Nami and Lee Sin existing in the capacity that they do, we're not going to get to see this challenger-focused meta shine right now, and I think when it does get to shine, it will be very strong, and it might even fill in a lot more of the cracks of the meta than I'm giving it credit for. After all, Lee Sin and Nami are just 2 decks. We have to fill out everything else with other things, but I think that whatever Daybreak wants to do, Fiora is more likely to do it better for this particular seasonal. Now, is Fiora Leona an option? It's on the table. I definitely think that there are a lot of players like Black Boss, Dudu Denunu, a lot of Brazilians especially, that really fuck with the Demacia Targon combination, especially the mid-range style, going all the way back to like the Shyvana Asol, mid-range Demacia, quote-unquote dragon decks that we used to have, and I think we're going to look a little bit more reminiscent of that. Maybe not as much finishing power, maybe we got to figure out what the top end looks like. I don't know if it's going to be ready in time for the seasonal. Maybe we'll have a good enough list, but not a super optimal list, and we'll see when the next expansion drops what that super optimal list actually looks like. But for now, I'm not super confident in the Daybreak package doing, really pushing its way into the meta, unless it is specifically Fiora Leona. I think that without Overwhelm or Elusive, you're just giving these OTK decks a little bit too much time to set up while they stall you out with things like Double Trouble, all the other things that they have to muck up the board. You're still very susceptible to cards like Homecoming and Concussive Palm, and you do kind of need to be in Demacia to get those points of interaction, like single combat that's going to take advantage of the stats of your units, rallies to try to end the game. And overall, I think that it will have a place in a meta eventually. I just don't think it's this one, but I am optimistic for the future of the archetype. Sun Guardian, I think, is a really cool change because this card was not main deckable previously. You'd get it off Ravoon and you'd probably even feel kind of bad about it, but now it fills out the 3-cost spot in a more board-centric way than Solari Priestess does. So I think this is a really good change for the archetype as a whole, really helps you round out the curve a lot better, because Solari Priestess could feel a little awkward. Again, you weren't really banking spell mana, so you couldn't take advantage of like the good spells that would come out of the Priestess, and you already had good units to play for the curve of like Traveler and the Warrior, and then Golden Sisters is so far in the future that usually you weren't thinking about it. Also, you already just have one of the best lifesteal units in the game in these 4-mana 5/4, so it's like, yeah, I don't really know if we need to go for the Priestess route. I'm sure it'll still be in the deck, but Sun Guardian is probably a much better turn 3 play if your plan is to curve into Leona than Solari Priestess was. So very happy with the Sun Guardian change. Morning Light, yeah, you're losing a little bit of stats here. You're losing a few Daybreak activations, but let's be real, you were never main decking this card anyway. You were playing it as Leona's champion spell, and in that function, I think this is still fine. Again, it could be pretty taxing on your mana, and if you have Ravoon out, then this sort of leans more into, playing more units units first to get the stuns off and then Morning Lighting, rather than just getting a bunch of stuns from Leona and all these other effects activating and whatnot, especially because like you have the Sunhawk, so like there's multiple things that stun. Overall, very cool. Solari Stellacorn doesn't have the picture here, but instead of healing allies 3, it will now give other allies +0/+2 this round. Also a 4-mana 3/4 rather than a 5-mana 4/6. I don't think this card sees play. I think your 4-drop slot is already taken up by the Solari Sunforger, I believe is the name of the lifesteal unit, and you'll probably find something in your other region to throw into the 4-cost slot. I don't think it's like hyper important to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 curve to level the Leona here. I think you can take a turn off and be fine with that, or, you know, find your Sunforger or what have you. Sunburst is not quite a Daybreak card in the sense that, like, I don't really evaluate it that way. This is a card that has been played, will be played in multiple different kinds of Targon decks from the dawn of time until the end of time. Now, of course, getting changed to 5 cost looks like a buff, but Piltover and Zon has been the go-to combination with Targon for quite some time, and now you no longer have access to this in the Pharaoh's Financier pool, but I'm fine with that, honestly. I like this more as a main deck-focused card. I think silencing and dealing 6 to something to get around buffs is really cool. You're not going to feel as tempo negative if this gets denied or something like that. And while we don't have a Targon deck that this sort of naturally fits into right now, it kind of depends on where Leona goes, but we don't really have any other Targon decks in the meta that I can think of that are just like, okay, yeah, now we can slot this in to deal with Lee Sin without needing to worry about the barrier, or like, oh, I'll just kill Nami even through the pump spells, or anything along those lines. But, you know, it's a very good change, and it's one that'll probably go unnoticed because Sunburst hasn't always been like an auto-include in every Targon deck, but maybe now we get to up that a little bit more, and, you know, we'll just see it around. But again, it's kind of a meta call card. Is there a threat in the meta that you need to silence before you deal the 6 damage to it? Are you not getting enough removal out of your other region? Things of that nature, but overall, a great buff for Targon as a whole. That said, likely no impact for this seasonal unless we get it into the Daybreak decks, but like Poppy Tarek, which I think is the best Targon deck right now, not going to be running this card, right? Historically speaking, fearsome decks, by which I mean Wraithcaller decks, so Shadow Isle Allegiance, have popped up now and then as a counter pick to specific metas. It was very popular at the first seasonal tournament where Go Hard was expected to be the best deck, and Doom Beast was the only fearsome blocker in that deck's repertoire unless they plundered a Jagged Butcher. But for the most part, you could just fly over your opponent's units with these fearsome attackers and everything was hunky-dory. Now, it's been a long time since we've had a meta where fearsome really felt like it could break out, not so much since the Pale Cascade nerf, so it's been struggling a bit, but it has been getting a slow drip of new cards for quite some time, perhaps my favorite being Harrowing Returns, which revives an ephemeral copy of the Strongest Dead allied follower and gives enemies -1/-0 this round. You know, works very well if you can get it onto a Wraithcaller or a Frenzied Skitterer or something along those lines, but ultimately I think that the fearsome archetype has been slowly getting a lot of support. I don't know that it's amounting to enough, but we do see one deck at least specifically pops out in my mind as something that maybe fearsome could have some game against, and that is Nami Twisted Fate. You know, ideally they want to pass turn 1, pass turn 2, play a Double Trouble on turn 3. Double Trouble, pretty unlikely to get them a fearsome blocker, and then, you know, turn 4, what's that looking like? Maybe Eye of Nagakoboros, I think, is sort of their quote-unquote best play, their ideal play in a solitaire situation. So maybe if Nami proves to be the most popular deck, which I think is what quite a few people are expecting right now, then fearsome actually has an avenue to be a nice counter pick, and Nocturne being able to level up on fearsome is really, really good, because previously the champions for this deck were a bit of a wish-washy problem. Like, yeah, maybe you throw in Elise and Callista just because they have fearsome. People would sometimes throw in Nocturne because of the -1 attack ability. You know, decks that are just on the cusp of having fearsome blockers, like, okay, we've got a couple of 3 attack units in there, still going to fall to the wayside to Nocturne and Frenzied Skitterer, and again, Harrowing Return. So now that Nocturne can actually level in these fearsome decks, which was completely off the table previously unless you wanted to jam in a bunch of sort of non-synergistic cards just to get to the Nocturne level, like things were just kind of falling apart. Now, I actually do have some hope for the fearsome archetype. I think that it has enough new tools, it has a solid enough foothold in the meta where these Ionia decks are running rampant. You are fast enough to really take advantage of the fact that these decks want to take the first couple of turns of the game off. A Nocturne level is game-ending, it's just difficult to do, and so now the question becomes, you know, what are the splash cards? Has anybody been paying enough attention to fearsome recently to have a solid shell for them to slot this into? Because we don't have much time until the seasonal. But if this deck does have the game against Twisted Fate Nami that I realistically think it might, then do you have enough time to refine that? Find the splash card. You know, Twisted Fate Nami, it can be very difficult once they get the Nami online, but I think that you are putting enough pressure out that your opponent probably can't bank the spell mana as effectively as they want to, especially if you are, going for this Wraith strategy. The amount of burst speed attackers that you have, even just out of the Risen Mists, can really surprise your opponent that maybe wasn't even prepared for like a Nocturne level up, and just giving all of your units Fearsome, which really probably only going to apply to Wraithcaller, maybe a couple of other things that you throw in there. But for the most part, I think, yeah, like either Elise Nocturne or maybe even Callista Nocturne. It kind of depends on how many 2-drops you want to fit in there. I think actually does have a real shot at being like maybe just a top 32 specific deck, maybe not a Swiss deck if you are just looking to hone in more on these Ionia lists that are not playing a lot of Fearsome blockers, and save that more for a top 32. It's something that I'm interested in. I think it's a possibility. I'm not like super sold on it, but I definitely think this is something that players should have on their radar. Now on to something that is not really getting added into the Fearsome archetype in my opinion, and that is Vile Maul in the Twisted Treeline. I think this card is just too slow for what the deck is looking to exploit, which is players taking off the first few turns of the game. You really want to be sort of snowballing the pressure that you're putting on in the early stages of the game, and the Twisted Treeline is just such a huge tempo loss that you're not even activating reliably until like turn 5, because I don't think you have a Fearsome 1-drop unless you are splashing Precious Pet in your Wraithcaller deck. Because Stygian Onlooker isn't going to have Fearsome if you play it as a 1-drop. Maybe you like play an Elise and then you play Twisted Treeline and then you play like another Fearsome unit and Stygian Onlooker on turn 4, and that's like the fastest you're going to be able to get the Vile Maw out. And the Vile Maw isn't even summoned attacking, so just sort of another weird tempo loss. Like giving your other Fearsome allies +1/+0 is kind of cool, but if you are a Myth-Wraith focused strategy, then that's not really something you're as interested in, because they're all getting their buffs from themselves anyway. They don't really care about this extra Vile Maw sort of pretending to be a Mist-Wraith, especially for the tempo negative. And that's just if you open with it, right? If you draw this card later on in the game, it's absolutely nothing. Because, again, the Vile Maw does not come in attacking, at least from how I'm reading this card. It just says destroy me to summon Vile Maw, not summon an attacking Vile Maw. So, like, it's just way too slow for what the deck is trying to exploit, in my opinion. Now, as someone that gets excited about maybe some of the nerdier, like, hyper-specific counter picks of top 32 gameplay in Legends of Runeterra, I'm very excited for a Tahm Kench buff. Because the last time this card was broken out, it was as a counter pick to Nami. Before that, it was a counter pick to Lee Sin. And whether it fits into Starspring or a different kind of deck, we've seen it in, I believe it was actually Nami Tahm Kench that people were playing when Nami Targon was very good. They'd play this as the second champion as opposed to Zoe to get some points in the Nami mirror. And I think that with how prevalent both Nami and Lee Sin are in the meta right now, this is a great time for Tahm Kench to come in and shine. And getting the acquired taste on play is a very big deal, because if your opponent is playing something like Nami, previously they'd play the Nami, you'd play the Tahm, you would go to untap, and now in response to your acquired taste, they have all this mana to play with to fire off all the spells on the Nami in order to buff up all their units and make it so that losing the Nami wasn't as big of a deal. Now with Tahm getting it on play, you not only get to eat that Nami before your opponent gets to untap, if your other Tahm Kench is dealt with and the Nami or Lee Sin or what have you is spat back out, you can immediately eat it again by playing a second Tahm Kench. Because one of the problems that players would run into is you would play a Tahm Kench, the round starts, you get the acquired taste in hand. If that first Tahm Kench dies and you play a new Tahm Kench, it cannot play the acquired taste from the previous Tahm Kench. Now it will create its own acquired taste on play, and that is just a nice little quality of life change for players that like have their Tahm Kench dealt with. Ultimately, I can't think of what deck this is going to fit into. Maybe we will just see Nami Tahm Kench Ionia as opposed to Twisted Fate. It's not outside the realm of possibility, and I'm excited for it. I love when Tahm Kench does come out as a counter pick for the seasonal tournaments. I don't know why. There's just something about Tahm doing that tickles me, and I definitely think this is going to have an impact. There's no picture for Master Yi, so just in case you need a reminder of what this card does, the round start going to reduce the cost of a spell in your hand by 1 this round. Now it will just reduce the cost by 1 permanently, and when you flow, you grant all allied Master Yis everywhere +2/+0, and then the level 2 side gains this text, attack, I immediately strike the weakest enemy. I think this change fundamentally changes the identity of Master Yi, and now you don't even have to worry about leveling him up. I think this is just a very, very good level 1 champion that you can throw into just about any Ionia deck and feel good about it, because just sitting there and sort of ramping you in the sense that you are just reducing the cost of spells in your hand turn after turn, assuming that this can no longer hit a 0-cost spell. This is a huge change for the region as a whole. I'm not sure If this is going to be enough to like maybe push it into playability as like a unit over Master Yi, or over Twisted Fate rather, in the Nami deck or anything along those lines. Akshan Lee Sin not going to go for this either. Ultimately, I think that Master Yi as a finisher is not how you want to be looking at this card. I think it's a really cool engine. It'll probably even start to spawn some new archetypes, but the Master Yi experimentation I expect will now be at an all-time high come the start of this balance patch. And, you know, going into the Awakening Seasonal, can we land anywhere on a Master Yi deck? It's a good question. I'm not sure I have an answer for you on that one, because I don't think that... I think the Ionia decks that currently exist are very focused and locked in on the champions that they're currently playing. You know, maybe we get a Master Yi Victor instead of a Victor Lee Sin or a Victor Karma, especially if Ken and Ezreal nerfs are substantial enough that players fall off of that deck and the Ionia Piltover and Zon region combination opens up. Yeah, I could see Master Yi fitting into the PNZ style of play, especially because, you know, you get Pharaoh's Financier in there, you're manifesting some more expensive spells. Master Yi can, you know, help mitigate that a little bit. You know, maybe even get your Glorious Evolution top end online a little bit earlier. Like, I think that this is a really cool change to Master Yi, and at some point, this card is going to have to be viable, right? Maybe don't focus so much on winning with it. You don't even have to activate Flow every turn. I think you just play this card for the cost reduction. If you can find a deck that wants that and has an open champion slot, absolutely jam Master Yi in there. But I don't think he's really fitting into any of the existing ones outside of, like I said, maybe the Victor. Maybe you even go like PNZ Karma Master Yi. That sounds a little bit copium, but, you know, I think that the Victor Master Yi is a realistic possibility for players that already have the Lee Sin allocated in the Akshan in their lineup, or even if they're playing Lee Sin in the Nami because they just chose not to play the Akshan deck. I'm big on this one. Pretty big on this one. It's been so long since Fiora was nerfed and became unplayable that I don't really fault players for sort of over-remembering the nostalgia of the Fiora alternate win condition. When you played Shen Fiora, that accounted for a very small amount of your victories. There were a couple of different Voltron Fiora decks. I think Freljord and Targon were the most popular ones, so to speak. But neither of those were ever, like, super competitively viable, which is probably a good thing. Nowadays, though, even if we're looking at Shen Fiora, with this new stat line on Fiora, I think that gone are the days where we think of this as just a 3-mana sort of 3/3 value challenger, and I think you do get to play into the win condition a lot more, especially with the release of new cards like Memory's Cloak, for example, a tool that Fiora did not have access to in the past. I think that actually changes things a lot. I'm not sure how viable it is to go all in on a Fiora strategy, mostly because with, you know, Nami and Lee Sin and specifically Ionia being the most dominant region in the game right now, Deny is something that's on a lot of players' minds. A lot of Shadow Isle Bandle City players, which is sort of, you know, a very solid regional combination, whether you're on the Heimerdinger Nora, the Nora Vygar, good old Darkness. Mini-Morph is something that players are looking at to deal with these Namis and these Lee Sins and a way to slip under the Deny and all the counter spells that we have in the meta right now. So I think that going for a Voltron Fiora is a very risky strategy, given the amount of Mini-Morphs that are coming back into the meta, especially given that, you know, if you're playing against Ionia, the Fiora win con is a little hampered by the amount of stuns and recalls that your opponent has available, even just resetting the Fiora. So I don't think that's something we're going to see for the seasonal, but I do think that Shen Fiora, you know, has a chance to spearhead the board-centric style of play again. And part of that is pushed by the fact that these Ionia decks, they don't deal with low-to-the-ground Demacia decks very well. I'm talking things like, you know, the Lulu Poppy, Scouts. These are decks that can kind of slip in under the cracks, take advantage of the fact that they don't want to play the game for the first few turns, and something like Shen Fiora should do very well against those kinds of decks. So this might even just be the solid third Ionia deck in a player's lineup that is looking to be their hedge against the Scouts and the Poppy decks and all these different kinds of things. Now, is that how things are going to play out? No, but or maybe rather not. Rather, maybe not. You know, I can't really predict what the meta is going to look like just based off of these patch notes, but I think that that is a realistic direction for Fiora to head into as just sort of the ringer for these triple Ionia lineups. Now, outside of that, I don't think it's doing super well into the Nami or Twisted Fate decks on its own, or the Nami or Lee Sin decks, rather. But again, it does have a place in a lineup, and I'm kind of excited to see where this turns, because Shen Fiora, as it existed a year and a half ago, was easily one of the most boring decks to watch in Legends of Runeterra, and I'm hoping that the new cards that we've gotten since then can change the strategy a little bit, make it a little bit more exciting, especially with the new cost and stat line. But overall, I like the change a lot. I like this more than if you had just turned it back into a 3-mana 3/3. Is it better? That remains to be seen on how viable the win condition is, but for the most part, I like this more. So I love Swain, and this is, I would say, one of the most controversial changes in the balance patch. There are some people that think that this is absolutely broken, and now Swain's going to take over. There are some people that are saying this doesn't matter in the slightest because we're so Ionia-focused. Swain's just going to get bounced or stunned or anything like that. The Leviathin going to be near impossible to stick in a meta like this, and I agree with that. I've seen a lot of players posting Swain lists. Most of them have been Ionia, with one of the key features being, yeah, you know, let's Greenglade look out a turn 6 Leviathin, or let's, you know, deny the homecoming of the recall or something, get some protection on the Swain, right? We're not going back to Twisted Fate Swain here. And I think people are heading in the right direction, where you are kind of building this like a Viego deck, right? Where you look at your powerful 7 drop, used to be Hydravine, now it's Leviathan, you're like, yeah, let me reduce the cost of that with Greenglade Lookout. I just stick my champion on 5, everything's hunky-dory from there. But what I don't see people adapting from the Viego style of gameplay is Syncopation, which I think is a massive tool for Swain if you want to exist in this Ionia meta. I think that players are not putting enough damage spells in their decks. I've played a lot of Swain. Ravenous Flock is not going to carry you to a Swain level up. And base Swain, not too different from old Swain, right? You need to get to that level 2 to get that Overwhelm, and you need damage spells to get that done. That said, in the current metagame, there's not a lot of interaction at fast speed, meaning you can probably just jam Noxian Fervor back into your Swain deck, and you don't even have to do it on anything fancy. You can just, like, throw it onto a House Spider or the Spiderling that comes out of the House Spider in order to get half your Swain level up done already. Swain is much better suited for the Fiora Leona kind of meta that I was talking about earlier, much better than this Lee Sin Nami focused meta, but you definitely have a place here still. The threats that your opponents are putting out are kind of light, and maybe you go like Bandle City Swain instead of Ionia Swain, and rather than focusing on protection for the Swain and developing the Leviathan Swain combo, you go more for Mini Morph to deal with the significant threats that your opponent is outputting. Use Swain as something to just get the resources out of your opponent's hand, play a little bit more low to the ground. There's a couple of different ways that players could take this, and I'm excited to see which one comes out on top, but the thing that immediately jumps into my head is I want to play Ionia Swain, I want to play 3 Syncopation, I want to play Noxian Fervor, I want to play House Spider to give me, you know, avenues to play my Fervor and my Syncopation. There's a lot of good 2-drops in Ionia and Noxus that you can really start to build up this sort of repertoire with, and I don't think you're really going to miss out too much on the tools from Bilgewater, especially with Riptide Sermon taking a nerf, as that was another great way to get half of the Swain level up. Yeah, you don't have any AoE, and maybe players are going to look more for a region with that, but the big thing that I've seen out of the early Swain lists that people have been putting out since this change was announced is that they're not putting enough damage into the deck to actually level a Swain. So just something to keep in mind, you know, once you build a Swain deck, rather than taking it straight the ladder, I would definitely queue up a co-op versus AI game and just make sure that you can consistently level the Swain with the tools that you have given yourself available. But I'm not sure what champion you're going to pair with this. Master Yi actually does seem like an appealing option in my head, given the permanent cost reduction on spells, and I think just loading this up into a removal and protection loaded deck is very appealing to me. So that's kind of my starting point for this, is going to be Master Yi Swain with triple Syncopation. That's just, you know, I'm not too worried about activating Flow on the Master Yi like I had mentioned during his change, but that's kind of where my mind starts with this change, and I think it's going to be really, really fun. I'm just going to blow past the Illaoi and Ornn's changes. I don't think these have any impact on the meta. Ornn hasn't seen play outside of Timelines, and even that is not the Timelines variant that you see. Timelines also got nerfed, so, like, I don't know about that one. Ornn and then Illaoi, just too many of your cards have been nerfed to you. Probably could have been a 1-8 and it wouldn't have made a difference here. But yeah, just not much to say about these two champs. Especially because, can we talk about how much of a nerf to Illaoi the printing of Quietus was? Like, good luck, Illaoi. I don't even know how to pronounce this, man. I'm going to say, like, Iula? Well, let's say Iula. It's no Zenith Blade, and I don't want you to look at this card and think that, okay, Zoe Lee Sin's back on the table, Pantheon Demacia is back on the table. That's not what we're doing here. But it is a buff to those archetypes, mostly the Faded one. You can't play it in the same turn as Wounded White Flame, but you really weren't playing Zenith Blade in the same turn as Wounded White Flame either, because you were waiting until, you know, you could actually Daybreak it. But that said, it's a cool boost. It's nothing spectacular. It's not going to, like, bring these decks back to the forefront of the meta, I don't think. But the option between Overwhelm and Spell Shield is very good. It just might be putting Pantheon, like, on the cusp where, like, it just needs a little bit more. But I think the deck was already, like, you know, maybe tier 3, but maybe now it's high tier 3. I don't know. Papertree, completely irrelevant. Just gonna skip over that. Shrieking Spinner, also irrelevant. Ritual of Renewal, also irrelevant. You know, kind of sucks you can't pull it off Pharaoh's Financier anymore, because sometimes heal 7 draw 1 was your go-to. Now you might end up seeing this played in some decks. I don't think it's the best option, but people will play it. and that just kind of is what it is. I don't think you should, but they will. Ripper's Bay is, like, weird, because this doesn't do anything for Lurk, but it does create situations like this where Sunny posted this deck on Twitter where the idea is, you know, now everything in your deck is a Lurker. Pike is going to get shuffled in by Evil Imperfectionist. Hopefully the Pike champion spell, Death from Below, goes into the deck as Evil Imperfectionist, so now it's 3 mana. So now you can pull it with Zap Sprayfin, otherwise you just pull Fallen Feline Crystals. And ultimately you're just playing a bunch of 1-drops in Lurker's Bay, or Ripper's Bay, and trying to turn everything into a Lurker and sort of overwhelm your opponent in that way. But from a competitive standpoint, I don't think Ripper's Bay is doing anything, because this looks like a YouTube deck, right? And we're not really seeing YouTube decks win seasonals too often. Leviathan change, really cool for Twisted Fate Swain specifically, as now you get to curve Leviathan into Riptide Rex. But again, I think that we've kind of moved away from Bilgewater as a Swain archetype now that we have, you know, Overwhelm and just sort of the meta that we find ourselves in, the meta that we might find ourselves in that Swain would fit well into. But overall, very happy with the Leviathan change. There's not a lot of good 7-mana cards in Legends of Runeterra, so I think that having a power play on 7 when your opponent doesn't sometimes is something that can solo swing a game. And overall, you know, I'm very happy with this change as a Swain fan, especially, you know, only losing 1 health, not losing any attack. You're still pushing out a fair amount of damage if you do decide to take this thing into combat. And, you know, I really said my piece on this when I talked about Swain earlier, if I'm being honest. Magical Journey, this is nothing. Realm's Caretaker, this is nothing. Grumpy Rockbear, not nothing, because we have seen Grumpy Rockbears come into play off of... Oh man, the name of the skill is Teen Spirit, and the name of the unit is actually evading me. But it is the 4-mana 2/4 that kills a landmark if it's an allied one, summon a Grumpy Rockbear. We're not really getting into Grumpy Rockbear Tribal anytime soon, but this almost does feel more like a Path of Champions buff, where this is something that you're forced to play in a lot of Path decks. Funsmith, very upset that the change was not enter the battlefield, improvise a Catalyst. I think a lot of players were really hoping that's what Funsmith was going to do. Maybe you have to up it to 5 mana at that point, but the 1 attack, it's a bummer. It's still a bit of a bummer. Mammoth Shaman. Freljord has been pretty absent for quite some time. You know, Freljord tends to be the worst region in the game. I think if you go back and look at a lot of seasonals, then unless Plunder or Thralls were good, which are some of the least Freljord decks that exist, then you're really not seeing Freljord topping the charts, and I don't think Mammoth Shaman is what we were kind of waiting on to revive that archetype. Windsinger, on the other hand, is another very hotly debated card that I've seen, where, you know, this card was already 6 mana play recall a unit. Now it's got Elusive, though, which does make it a much more appealing option for, say, Nami. I'm not sure if they can fit in something like this when some of your more awkward hands are already ones that were sort of like multiple Shelly with no way to go wide. But this is a very appealing competitive option when you know that you're going up against these other, like, Lee Sin decks that you can bounce to the hand. But ultimately, I think this shines more in a meta where Ionia isn't the standard, and people are trying to drop more Leviathans on turn 7 and things like that against you, where your recall effects pack a lot more of a punch. Right now, I think that a lot of the meta that you're going to be seeing is just a little bit too built around the fact that Homecoming exists to be susceptible to something like Windsinger. So I'm not really expecting an insane spike in the play rate of Windsinger this seasonal. I think it will happen eventually, but again, I think this is something that is better suited for non-Ionia metas than Ionia metas, if that makes sense. So, very curious to see where the actual play rate of this card ends up, because I could see this being more popular in the Nami deck, maybe even the Lee Sin deck, or any other Ionia deck that we end up playing. I just personally don't think it fits, but, you know, I could be wrong on that one. But I definitely think, like, this change is extremely impactful, and this card will see play. I just don't think it's going to, like, you know, be a mandatory 2 of in everybody's lineup and every Ionia deck going into the Awakening seasonal. But I could be wrong. So now getting into the nerfs, Viego was not an entirely unexpected nerf. Evelyn Viego has been a prominent ladder deck for the entire season, as well as a little bit last season. Of course, now we've got the new version of Thresh Viego popping up, but that actually wasn't on the radar when the balance patch got locked in, at least based on what I looked at 2 weeks ago. But I think what they were really trying to target here was just the interaction with Greenglade Lookout, you know, giving you the ability to curve Viego into Invasive Hydrovine. That was probably something that they felt was a little unhealthy. So now, even if you, like, now you can do it, but you can't do it a turn sooner, like you were, like, instead of 5-6, it's 6-7, which I think is a much healthier sort of stat line to go for. And yeah, once Viego came down, he's very difficult to remove. He started to take over the game. Turn 5 is just a little early for that to be happening. I don't know how this is going to affect Viego decks. I don't think they were going to be particularly popular going into the Awakening seasonal anyway. But overall, I mean, like, they make good points, right? Like, Viego has been a pretty dominant deck for a while in a couple of different variants. So, like, yeah, he probably needed a nerf. I didn't think it was going to come in the form of a cost increase, to be honest. That's one of the bigger ways that you can hit something. But ultimately, I'm just neutral on this one. Like, I don't really think it's that bad. I don't think it's super warranted. But I'm like, I'm just so uninterested in it for some reason. So then we get into the reverts, Hate Spike going back up to 2 mana. I think this card's going to be fine. It'll probably be more of a 2 of than a 3 of, but I think it just kind of opened the floodgates on how good this card actually is. And we've already seen the Shadow Isle decks start to fall off. You're not seeing nearly as much Red Gwen or Nasus as you were a couple of weeks ago. It's been replaced by, you know, like Thresh Viego, these Nora decks. And for those, I think it's fine. You know, it's not going to feel as good. It was pretty broken at 1 mana, but I think the card is still going to see play. Probably not as a 3 of, though. And then Mark of the Storm, there's a lot of debate about whether or not this kills Kennen Ezreal, and I think it does. I think Kennen Ezreal was sort of like barely the best deck, and this deck, or even just this change specifically, might have been all it took to really open the floodgates and push us into that Fiora Leona kind of meta that I talked about earlier, rather than this Lee Sin Ionia meta. It's really hard to tell where, like, the massive overall meta implications of this are, but I think that with you not having to worry about, you know, just like this getting stunned out constantly, there's one less recall deck that you kind of need to worry about. So if you're banning either Lee Sin or Nami come seasonal time, you really only have one recall deck to worry about. You can kind of focus on what is that last deck going to be, and that's always kind of the question mark coming into seasonals. Usually you'll have like 1 or 2 decks that feel very good, and then finding that third one is a bit of a pain. And the third one is usually the exploitable one, but it's also the one that is the least played. So I don't think we're going to see like a massive meta shift, not in a week and a half anyway. I just don't think there's enough time before the seasonal, but I do think that this does a very good job of setting us off on the right foot when the next expansion drops, in terms of making sure that it's not an Ionia-dominated day 1 on ladder. So ultimately, you know, I am fine with this change. I think Kennen Ezreal was like pretty boring to watch, pretty boring to play, so definitely not going to be upset if it is just removed from the meta, which I'm leaning more towards yes on that one than no. Sai'nen kind of randomly took a nerf. This was only played in Kennen Ezreal as well, and I don't think you were really playing this for like the massive butt that it had. So sure, I don't think the Sai'nen nerf really pushes the Kennen Ezreal deck back out of playability, but I do think that Mark of the Storm at 3 damage was really the only reason that deck popped up in the first place. So like RIP Sai'nen kind of, but like you were played for the draw 2 ability. Like the 5 health was cool, but it wasn't everything. So, you know, I'm sure you'll be fine. Riptide Sermon and Decimate, 2 pillars of the pirate aggro community. How are we feeling about pirates, you know? Sermon goes down from deal 4 to a unit, spawn 3, deal 2 to the Nexus, to deal 3 to a unit, spawn 3, deal 1 to the Nexus, which is a big deal because you no longer hit base Veigar, you no longer hit level 2 Nami, both of which are very prominent cards, especially going into the seasonal tournament. I think Pirates was only in the position that it was because it had a very overtuned Riptide Sermon, but Eye of Nagakaboros staying the same does give me some hope that Pirates can still stick around. I'm not sure if it's going to be better than Scouts now, like you might just have a better Misfortune deck to put into your lineup given the current metagame. Decimate to 6 mana is surprising to me because when I talked 2 weeks ago about them coming after regional staples, I wasn't thinking of Decimate. I was thinking of Glimpse Beyond, I was thinking of Homecoming, I was thinking of Rally spells. So they went along with a philosophy that I had proposed, but just went after a region that I did not expect. And I've seen a lot of discourse about Decimate not being the issue, instead 3-2 Legion Rearguard being the issue, and I can agree with that to an extent. I am a little surprised to see the Decimate nerf. It's not great for Pirates. I think Pirates was only like this because it was overtuned. If you just go back to the 12-1 drop aggro, you know, you no longer play the Tentacle package, it's kind of whatever, but I don't know. The Decimate nerf feels misplaced. The Riptide Sermon doesn't feel like enough. I think you probably wanted to hit Eye of Nagakaboros as well, just because that was the starting point for every Bilgewater deck, and like even with Riptide Sermon gone, every Bilgewater deck is probably still starting with 3 Eye of Nagakaboros, and that is... I think a card that you are just going to have to nerf eventually, and I'd rather see you do that sooner than later. But I don't know. I'm not a fan of the Decimate nerf. The Riptide Sermon one I'm fine with. I think that's cool. I think taking away the 4 damage from the unit was sort of what I wanted to see. I wanted to be able to like play my Viego on 4 and have it live against pirates without needing to worry about, you know, whatever. But the Decimate one does not feel good to me. But I do think this means that pirates is just either going to have a complete overhaul in what it looks like, or like is just dead. And dead is absolutely the wrong term, because when I say dead, I mean it will no longer be like top 3 ladder deck 55% win rate. I mean, like, it'll go back to like the pretty mediocre 12-1 drop aggro, spikes every now and then alongside spiders deck that we had. Making sure that they hit all their bases. The Harrowing has been nerfed. Red Gwen used this as a solid finisher. Shadow Isle Nami would play this as a finisher, but it's been a while since we've seen Shadow Isle Nami. Everybody unanimously switching over to the Ionia variant. And, I don't know. I'm not the biggest fan of this, just because I think that when you play the Harrowing, the game should end if you have a deck built around ending the game when you play the Harrowing. Anivia comes to mind, the Hecarim decks come to mind. Usually those were Hecarim Ionia, which is now a much less appealing option given that you cannot Harrowing and deny in the same turn. But this is actually a revert on a buff, if I remember correctly. I think Harrowing was originally 10 mana and then went to 9 mana not too long after the release of Rising Tides, and that was what made the Anivia deck a little bit more appealing, was just how quickly you could Harrowing. So where do I stand on it? I didn't really think Harrowing was the problem in Red Gwen. I thought it was more Midnight Raider specifically. I think that was the card that sort of gave me the most frustrating play patterns every time I saw it. The Harrowing going up a mana is kind of a weird thing to conceptualize in Red Gwen, because you were never playing this card on curve. So the fact that it's like getting pushed back from turn 6 to turn 7 means very little, because usually that's still your setup turns. You know, maybe you'll play one of the Minotaurs on turn 5, and then turn 6 you're just kind of like running out the rest of your hand trying to set up for the Harrowing. So this feels like it actually hurts other potential Harrowing decks more than it hurts Red Gwen specifically, but I do think you needed to do something to Red Gwen. This isn't the card that I would have gone after, but I mean, ultimately I think it's like a fine change, because we were probably just going to continue to have Harrowing decks pop up every now and then. If one of them actually did care about playing this on curve and could turn 6 it, yeah, that'd be a little bit scarier than turn 7. I'm like fine with games starting to end on turn 7, or at least like making a deterministic end game on 7. For example, like if I slam down a Swain Leviathin combo and you're not a deck that can deal with that, the game is effectively over, but it's not actually over. 7 mana Harrowing, or turn 7 Harrowing, you know, going to look to actually end the game. And I'm not really, like, I don't think there's a big difference between deterministically ending the game and actually ending the game. So like if turn 7 Swain Leviathin ends the game, turn 7 Harrowing might as well actually end the game. And then when we look at Rite of Calling going to 1 mana from 0, this is a nice change, because doing anything in response to a 0 mana spell just felt wrong, right? You want a little bit more commitment out of your opponent than that, so like nopifying a Rite of Calling felt pretty bad. But this is definitely a card that has contributed heavily to the power level of Shurima. So again, this feels like a regional staple that is getting come after. I just thought we'd be going after Shadow Isle regional staples outside of Hate Spike, like Glimpse Beyond, or like Demacian regional staples like Relentless Pursuit or Golden Aegis or Ionian ones. Instead, we went after Shurima and Noxus, which Shurima, yeah, I can get behind that. I don't know that Rite of Calling is the card I would have gone after, but yeah, I'll accept it. I'll accept it, you know? I don't think this is what I wanted, but I'm definitely fine with it. I don't think it really has like a big impact on any specific deck. You're still going to see it played as often as it is. Now we get to the changes that are wild to me. So Targon's Peak went to 6 mana. While Peak's gameplay hasn't been dominating, we're worried about a deck with this much variance holding a notable share of the meta. With an extra mana on the Peak, you'll have a little more time to execute your game plan before the opponent reaches the mountaintop. What was the notable share of the meta? So 2 weeks ago, I put out a video where it was like, hey, this is the day that they're locking in the patch. Let's take a look at the ladder. And I didn't really go past the top 10, but anything below the top 10 only had like a 3% play rate or so. So I'm really not sure where Targon's Peak was taking up most of the meta. Now, I was filtered by all 3 regions, so it is possible that, like, let's APAC, for example, like Targon's Peak was a top 5 deck, but it was so buried under the other decks when you filter all 3 regions together that, you know, it was whatever. Like, I don't really care about Targon's Peak getting nerfed, it just seems weird to me. And then Timelines, this is not the nerf that I thought they were going to do. Timelines has been nerfed before because the deck was annoying and toxic rather than being good, and that was when Timelines originally came out, and you could turn Ladros into the Dreadway, and it would one-shot your opponent's Nexus because it would double the Ladros damage. The way that they got around it at that point was they buffed Dreadway to 8 mana. And it made Dreadway more playable, which was really cool. It was overall a great change. And that was the only problem we had with Timelines at the time, was that specific interaction of Ladros into Dreadway. That deck was neither popular nor good, and yet the change happened. So when Weapon Masters started to come in and use Timelines in a rather toxic way, you know, all of a sudden we're getting, like, there are plenty of screenshots of people, like, timelining turn 1 into an Ionian Hookmaster Boxtopus on, like, turn 2, or, like, you know, whatever the 4-drop is. Just, like, your opponent would get crazy stats out of nowhere because of the Weapon Master. So rather than nerfing Timelines into a range where your opponent can no longer curve Timelines into a 2-drop, or you now have an opportunity to nopify it because they can't play it on turn 1, I was really hoping that we would actually just address the issue of Weapon Masters specifically, because I thought Trundle Timelines was a rather fair and interesting deck, and I'd hate to see this nerf take it off the map, because all of a sudden, like, you know, you're just kind of coin flipping the game on, does my Ionia opponent have nopify for my Timelines on turn 2? I don't love this change. I feel like this could have been done better. I'm not exactly, like, I didn't have a proposed change because it's not my fucking job. But I feel like that this could have been handled better. I'm not a fan of the Timelines nerf. So the end of the video actually kind of snuck up on me. I don't know why I thought there were more nerfs than that, but I did want to say thank you for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. I'm doing 4 YouTube videos a week now, so if you like my content, feel free to stick around, watch more of it. Leave a comment or two. Let me know what you thought of the change. What you thought the most impactful one was. What deck you want to try day 1? Because I'm definitely on that Swain life for the time being. So expect a gameplay of that tomorrow. And then as we get closer to the seasonal, the gameplay will shift more towards what we expect to see at the seasonal. But for Wednesday, no one really knows. So we're going to try out Swain. So subscribe, check back for that video tomorrow, and I will see you all then.